Hey guys, Caleb here from CDBS Studios, and welcome back to the series where I'm going over the entire MCU timeline. Today is going to be a very different kind of video on the timeline because today we are actually venturing out into the multiverse to talk about the various different branch timelines that exist outside of the MCU sacred timeline. If you want to catch up to where we currently were when we ended off last time, go watch the previous two videos, and if you want to get the basic information of the project, I did make a video for that as well. So I would encourage you to go watch those. But for right now, let's move into part 3, the multiverse. So we're going to start our timeline today with talking about the origins of the MCU multiverse, which starts us at Loki season 1. During the time heist in Avengers Endgame, the Loki variant from the 2012 New York ends up actually escaping with the Tesseract and crash landing in the desert, which allows him to get captured by the TVA and brought to their headquarters outside of time, where he learns about the fact that the TVA is apparently pruning any single universe that does not follow the sacred timeline's origin of events, and they're about to prune Loki, but he is saved by a agent named Mobius, who ends up enlisting Loki at the TVA to track down a rogue Loki variant who he later learns out is a girl named Sylvie. The two of them end up teaming up together to also take down the TVA after they later learn the TVA is not what everybody thought it was, as everybody at the TVA is actually just a variant who was stolen from the timeline and had their memories erased. And even they find out that the sacred timekeepers that the TVA worship and look to for advice and how the timeline should be written are actually frauds and robots. The real creator of the TVA is at the very end of time, and Loki and Sylvie are able to get there by going through the Void, which is a barren wasteland where the TVA sends everything they prune. They eventually are able to make it to the Citadel at the end of time, where they discover the man who created the sacred timeline is called He Who Remains. And apparently there was a past multiversal war where multiple variants of He Who Remains ended up fighting to preserve their universe but conquer the others. And it was only stopped when He Who Remains found a creature known as Eliath, who he used to end the multiversal war and turn the timeline into one single timeline. And he offers the two of them a choice. They can either kill him now and the multiverse will just branch out and they'll have another multiversal war to deal with, or they can take over the TVA and continue running it as the two of them. Sylvie wants to kill He Remains. Loki wants to rule the TVA. The two of them end up in a fight where Loki ends up tumbling backwards into the TVA while Loki ends up killing He Remains, which causes the multiverse to officially branch out into existence, which leads into Loki season 2, where the TVA learns that while they're letting the multiverse continue to branch out, that's actually becoming problematic because the TVA's temporal loom is starting to fail because there's so many new universe getting created. The only way to fix it is to find a variant of He Who Remains, which they do in the form of Victor Timely. They bring him back to the TVA and they're able to get to the temporal loom, but find the temporal loom is actually more of a fail-safe where no matter what they do, no matter what they do, when the temporal loom gets overloaded, it will explode and turn the multiverse back into the single sacred timeline. Loki eventually decides he needs to be the one to make the sacrifice, where he decides to become the god of stories, and he destroys the temporal loom, but in turn becomes the new temporal loom, holding the multiverse together as he forms the Yggdrasil's world tree. The rest of the TVA then spends the rest of their time, instead of pruning the timelines, they watch over the timelines and try to protect it from any He Who Remains variants who might threaten the multiverse in the future. Then this brings us into Deadpool and Wolverine, where we learn that there's a thing called anchor beings, where anchor beings are beings of such importance on different Earths that when they die, the universe slowly starts to decrease and slowly die. And on the Earth 10005, it was Wolverine. And when he dies, this means Earth 10005 is marked for destruction. But the TVA decides to spare the Deadpool of this universe. However, Deadpool doesn't want to see his universe die, so he ends up teaming up with the Wolverine from an alternate universe to go after ends up teaming up with the Wolverine from an alternate universe to try to save his universe. He ends up going through the Void and meeting a bunch of variants of characters before eventually returning to his universe and actually being able to prevent it from being destroyed. Then this eventually leads into finally the post-credit scene of Deadpool and Wolverine, where Deadpool returns to the TVA to explain to the audience that he is not the cause of Johnny Storm's death in the movie, because Johnny Storm did actually say all of the trash talk that he actually repeated to the movie's main villain. All right, now that we've established the multiverse's existence, now we're going to talk a little bit about the origin. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the time heist universe. The first of which is going to be the universe we're calling Time Heist Test, in which the only event we have on this is the test of the time heist, where Clint Barton uses the quantum tunnel to travel back to 2018 on his farm, where he ends up making sure the time machine works before returning to the present. This universe was most likely pruned at some point. Then we jump to the New York time heist, in which the first event we have is Steve Rogers, Tony Stark, Bruce Banner, and Scott Lang traveling back to the Battle of New York in 2012 to try to collect the space, mind, and time Infinity Stones. Bruce is able to get the time stone, while Steve is able to get the mind stone. But during the Tony and Scott's attempt to get the space stone, Loki is able to get his hands on it, and he escapes with it, which causes the two of them to actually escape with it, which leads to the event where Loki ends up crash landing in the desert, where the TVA finds him and captures him, and then we see them prune this universe. Then we jump to the Asgard Time Heist universe, in which Thor and Rocket actually time travel back to 2013 to get the Reality Stone, and also Thor steals Mjolnir from this timeline. This universe was most likely pruned, however, as when Steve Rogers came back here to return the Infinity Stone and Mjolnir, this universe probably just erased itself from existence. Then we have the Cosmic Time Heist universe, the universe where Rhodey, Nebula, Natasha Romanoff, and Clint Barton traveled back to 2014 to try to get the powers in Soul Stone. And this also was where the future Nebula got entangled with the 2014 one, and it allowed Thanos to actually time travel forward to be the main villain on the Sacred Timeline. However, this universe was probably pruned because Steve was able to return all the stones they stole, but the TVA probably did also prune it as well, because this universe didn't have Thanos in it, so this universe probably got pruned. Then the next universe we have from the time heist is the Camp Lehigh time heist, in which, due to the fact that they lost the Tesseract, Steve Rogers and Tony Stark travel back in time to Camp Lehigh at 1970 to get the Tesseract when it was there, and also new sets of Pym particles to get home. They're able to do that. Tony even gets to have a moment to reconnect with his father before they end up returning to the main universe. This universe was most likely pruned when Steve Rogers eventually did time travel back here to return the Space Stone. Then the final universe we have from the Time Heist is the Married Steve Rogers universe, which is during the events of the movie after Steve Rogers goes back in time to return all of the Infinity Stones. He ends up traveling back forward to 1949, where he travels to 1949, where he ends up living out his life with Peggy Carter, and they dance together at the end of Avengers Endgame. All right, now we're going to look at the branches from the Loki TV show, where the first universe we have is the Goddess of Mischief universe. This is Sylvie's home universe. The main thing we know about this universe is that Sylvie is captured by the TVA in 978, and then this universe is pruned slowly after. Then we have the TVA interference universe, I'm calling it, where in 1549, Sylvie ambushes a bunch of TVA agents, and in order to keep a child quiet, she gives them some gum from Asgard before she leaves. When the TVA arrives to take care of this timeline, they end up pruning it. Then we have the AIM Quantum Ore Shovel universe, in which Sylvie ends up digging with an AIM Quantum Ore Shovel to attract a bunch of TVA agents, and when they end up arriving, she ends up ambushing them in 1858 in order to steal their reset charges. This universe was pruned shortly afterwards, though, however. Then we jump to the Renaissance Fair, another universe where Sylvie jumped a bunch of TVA agents in 1985. However, the other TVA agents arrived to investigate the scene and then slowly pruned it afterwards. Then we have the Lamentis universe, the universe in which Loki and Sylvie get stranded in after their little fight at the TVA, where they get stuck on Lamentis when it's about to go through an apocalypse where it crashes into another planet, and they end up crashed in 2077. They end up together here in episode 3, before in episode 4 they are saved by the TVA and brought back before this universe ends up getting pruned. Alright, now we're going to talk about some of the Loki variant universes we see, which we don't really see, but we know they exist because we see their variants in The Void in Loki episode 5, where we first have the Statesman Survivor Loki, or Classic Loki's home universe, the universe where Loki actually survives the Statesman attack in Infinity War, but we know Classic Loki was captured and his universe was pruned. Then we have the universe Kid Loki's home universe, a universe where Kid Loki apparently killed Thor when they were kids. Apparently, shortly after, Loki was apparently captured and his universe was pruned. Then we have Alligator Loki's home universe. We don't really know fully what his Nexus event was. The only thing we get is that it might be because he ate the wrong neighbor's cat or something, but it could just be because of the fact that Loki was turned into an alligator in this universe and couldn't undo it. So we know he was captured at some point and pruned by the TVA. Then we have the Infinity Stones acquired Loki universe, the boastful Loki universe, the universe where Loki claims that he acquired all 6 Infinity Stones, killed Iron Man, Captain America, and Thanos, but we know at some point he was captured by the TVA and his universe was pruned. Then we have President Loki's home universe, the universe where it seems like Loki ran for president for some reason, but we know at some point he was captured by the TVA and his universe was indeed pruned. All right, now we're going to move into the season 2 universes. First we have branch 3311987, the universe of Sylvie's like working universe that she is. We first see this when she arrives in this universe in 1982. Then eventually Loki and Mobius arrive to recruit Sylvie for their mission in 1982 as well. And then in episode 5 of the series, Loki actually time slips back into this universe in 1982 as well. Then we have the Temporal Marvels universe. This is the universe that Victor Timely branches off into in season 2, and Loki and Mobius find him at the World Columbian Expo in 1893 when he is actually showing off all of his fun technology that he's been able to create using the TVA handbook. That's this. Next, we have the Temporal Loom Destroyed universe. This is the universe that Loki time slips into after the Temporal Loom fails for the first time in episode 4. Loki first arrives in this universe in 1962, where he actually finds the Alcatraz escapees and learns that one of them is actually the variant who goes on to be Casey. Then he also arrives in 1994 where he finds A.D. Doug, the guy who would go on to be Ouroboros the TVA. Loki is able to work with him to actually be able to get back to the TVA, which is good. Then also Loki time slips back to this point in time to talk to Sylvie as well in episode 6. Then we see Dr. Variety Willis's work. Dr. Variety Willis working in 2012, the variant who goes on to be B-15. And then we finally see Dawn in 2022 who goes on to be Mobius. All right, now we're going to talk about the Spider-Verse a little bit, where we have our first universe we're going to visit is 96283, the Webverse, the Raimiverse, as some of you guys might know it. The first events of this universe is in 2002 with the events of the first Spider-Man, in which we first see Peter Parker when he's on a class trip with his school. He gets bitten by the radioactive spider, and he slowly becomes Spider-Man. His Uncle Ben dies, and he comes up against Green Goblin before Green Goblin accidentally kills himself with his own glider, but Harry Osborn swears revenge because he thinks Spider-Man did it. And at the end of this movie, when MJ declares that she has feelings for Peter, Peter says he can't be with her, and he swings off into the sunset. We then jump 2 years later to 2004 for the events of Spider-Man 2, where Peter Parker starts to have his crisis where he doesn't know what he wants to be, if he wants to be Spider-Man or if he wants to be Peter Parker. This eventually clashes with him coming into confrontation with Dr. Octopus and also Harry Osborn, who learns his identity in this movie, as well as MJ. Peter and MJ start dating in this movie, and the Doc Ock also sacrifices himself in order to stop his dangerous machine. Then we jump 1 year later to 2003, where Peter Parker ends up in a little bit of a conflict where he comes into conflict with Harry Osborn, who finally comes after him as the new Goblin. He comes into conflict with Flint Marko Sammy, who is actually the one who killed Uncle Ben. And Peter gets infected by the symbiote Venom, who turns him into the symbiote before he gets the symbiote off, and it merges with Eddie Brock, who becomes Venom. Peter ends up fighting all these villains, and both Venom dies by Peter's hand, and Harry Osborn actually dies by Venom's hands, and Sandman actually leaves to go into hiding, and that's and Peter and MJ get back together at the end of this movie, which then we jump way later to 2024, which is the time when this version of when the Spider-Man No Way Home multiversal spell gets activated, and the Peter Parker of this universe actually gets dragged over to the main MCU. Before returning shortly afterwards. Now we're going to go over to Earth 120703, the universe of the Amazing Spider-Man movies, or the Webverse movies. The first event we have in this universe is in 2013, the events of the Amazing Spider-Man, where we once again see Peter Parker, where he is in love with Gwen Stacy in this universe, and while he's trying to confess his feelings to her at Oscorp, he gets bitten by the radioactive spider, who turns him into Spider-Man. At first, he just tries to be a vigilante to track down the guy who killed Uncle Ben, but he ends up fully adopting the Spider-Man persona, and then he also ends up trying to discover the secrets of his past with his parents, eventually meeting up with Kirk Connors and giving him the formula Connors uses to become the Lizard. Peter ends up going against Lizard and turning him back, but not before Lizard actually kills Gwen's dad, Captain Stacy. Peter then decides to wants to break up with Gwen Stacy in this movie, but Gwen says that it's her choice and she wants to stay with Peter. Then we jump 2 years later to 2015 for the events of the Amazing Spider-Man 2, where Peter Parker ends up in a little bit of a debacle with multiple villains, with Electro, a new version of the Green Goblin, and this time Harry Osborn, and it ends up culminating with Electro getting killed, Gwen Stacy actually being killed by Green Goblin, and Rhino being created by Green Goblin, which Peter ends up fighting as the movie ends, which then allows us to jump forward to 2024 where the multiversal No Way Home spell gets activated and this version of Peter Parker gets dragged over to the main MCU. Then we jump over to Earth 688, the main universe from the Sonyverse. The first event of this is Madam Web, in which a scientist by the name of Ezekiel Sims gets a vision of the future that these 3 Spider-Women are going to kill him. So he goes on a mission to try to kill those 3 Spider-Women before they get their powers. They are then protected by Madam Web herself, which in the end results in them killing Ezekiel Sims, but Madam Web also becoming paralyzed and blind. But she ends up using her powers of psychic link to end up coaching the 3 Spider-Women to go on to become the heroes of this universe. Then we jump way later to 2019 for the events of Venom, where the Venom symbiotes start arriving on Earth again. One of them, by the name of Venom, ends up escaping and latching onto Eddie Brock, who originally Venom is just using Eddie to get onto a plane that'll allow him to leave Earth, but Venom just starts to like Earth and Eddie, so the two of them work together to stop Riot, another symbiote who's trying to go back to their main planet to bring back a bunch of symbiotes to invade Earth. Venom is able to stop them, and Venom is presumed dead by everybody, but in reality, he is still alive, and him and Eddie now work together as kind of silent vigilantes. Then shortly later, we have the events of Morbius, where Michael Morbius is a scientist trying to cure his disease before he goes too far and ends up becoming a pseudo vampire. He eventually ends up fighting his friend named Milo. They end up in a battle that eventually ends with Milo dying and Morbius going on to become a pseudo anti-hero of this world. Before eventually the multiversal spell of No Way Home kind of interferes with this world a little bit, where Vulture from the MCU gets dragged over to this universe, and he decides to team up with Morbius to form some kind of pseudo Sinister Six. Also, then jumping forward to 2020, we come to the events of Venom Let There Be Carnage, where after is Venom and Eddie start to have a little bit of relationship drama as Venom wants to act out and kind of eat people and stuff, but Eddie doesn't want him to. They eventually come into contact with Cletus Cassidy, a known serial killer who takes a bit of Eddie's blood and becomes Carnage, another symbiote villain. He teams up with Shriek to go after Venom, but Venom eventually ends up killing both of them, and it leads to Venom going into hiding, which leads to shortly afterwards the multiversal spell of No Way Home gets activated and they get dragged over to the main MCU before shortly returning, which leads them on a journey to try to protect something called a codex, which was created between which was a link created between Venom and Eddie after Venom brought Eddie back to life at the end of the first Venom movie, and the symbiote king known as Null tries to get this codex, which will release him. This eventually culminates in Venom killing himself to destroy the codex, and Eddie ends up becoming just a normal human, just like everybody else. Then finally, we jump 2 years later to Kraven the Hunter, in which Kraven the Hunter goes after his father and ends up coming into contact with both the Chameleon and also Rhino. Now we're going to jump over to the MCU branches from the multiverse that we visited. The first universe we're going to visit is 838, the universe we visited in Multiverse of Madness. The first event we know of which is in 2018. This universe had its own version of Infinity War, but the Illuminati was actually able to stop Thanos. But then Black Bolt had to kill Doctor Strange after being asked by him to do it. Then we jump to 2021, where the Doctor Strange of our home reality of 616 jumps over to 838 and ends up going before the Illuminati in a trial sequence that later culminates in him getting to the Book of Ashanti. And also then we cut to the post-credit scene of Multiverse of Madness, where the curse that Doctor Strange put on Pizza Papa is finally over. Then we jump to the Utopian Parallel universe America Chavez originates from. The main event we know that happens here is that America Chavez, when she was young, had her first activation of her powers, which also made her lose both of her moms, and also she got lost into the multiverse. Then we have the Variant Killer Strange universe. This is the universe that Doctor Strange arrives on that has already gone through an incursion and is slowly being disintegrated. Doctor Strange is able to find another version of a dangerous, evil version of himself who he steals the Darkhold from and uses in the final battle against Wanda. This universe happens in 2024. Then we have Earth 617, the home universe of Defender Strange from the beginning of Multiverse of Madness, which the main events we know of this movie is that at some point in this universe, Doctor Strange meets America Chavez and the two set out to find the Book of Ashanti together. Then we jump to the Marvel Studios' reality. This is the universe that She-Hulk Fourth Wall breaks out into during the ending of She-Hulk Attorney at Law, where she goes onto the Disney lot and talks to the writer's room of her own show and talks to Kevin, the supreme robot overlord who runs the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And this all happens during the 2022 of this universe timeline. Then we jump over to X-Men Alley Binary, the universe that Monica gets stranded in at the end of the Marvels, where she gets stranded. She is found by Binary, or her mom in this universe, and she's brought to the X Mansion by Beast. This universe might just end up being Earth 1005, but for right now, it's set as an alternate universe. So this might change. This might change very early on later. And then we have the Earth 828, the main universe of the Fantastic Four First Steps that just came out. The first event of this universe we have is that in 1960, the Fantastic Four first go up as their first flight, and they end up getting their superpowers through the cosmic radiation. Then we have the 4-year upcoming from 1960 to 1964. This is that 4-year time clip video we see at the beginning of the movie where they go through learning how their powers work all the way up to the beginning of the movie where they fight Mole Man and they learn about their powers. They basically build up this world and their reputation. Then we go to 1964, which is the main events of the Fantastic Four, where they come into where the Silver Surfer marks Earth for death by Galactus, and the Fantastic Four fight Galactus when he wants Franklin Richards in return for their worlds. Eventually, the Fantastic Four are able to beat both Galactus and Silver Surfer by stranding them on the deep reaches of space, and the Fantastic Four are able to save their world. Then we jump to 1965 for the celebration of the Fantastic Five that we see at the very end of the movie, where they celebrate Franklin Richards being added to the team, and that we've had 5 years of the Fantastic Four. And then we jump 4 years later to 1969 for the post-credit scene of Fantastic Four First Steps, where a variant of Doctor Doom approaches Franklin Richards. Now we're going to jump to Earth 86445, the universe of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, where we have the first event of this universe is in 2015, where the Peter Parker of this universe, just as he's about to start high school at Midtown High, he is actually bitten by the radioactive spider who comes through a time portal created by Doctor Strange, and Peter gets bitten and gets his powers. Then we have the first episode of the season where Peter Parker, still in 2015, where Peter Parker has his rough upbringing as Spider-Man, where he builds like his rudimentary web shooters and his rudimentary suit. He fights a couple of low-level baddies, and eventually the episode ends with Peter Parker getting an internship at Oscorp from Norman Osborn. Then we jump to 2016 for the rest of the season, where Peter Parker works at Oscorp, being mentored by Norman Osborn as Spider-Man, because Norman Osborn figures out Peter's identity. Peter comes up against both Dr. Octopus and of course Scorpion. Lonnie Lincoln ends up becoming Tombstone this season, and the season actually ends up ending with Peter Parker becoming Spider-Man on his own, and also starting up the web protocol with both Harry and Nico and all of his friends. Now we're going to jump to the Horde Invades Earth universe that we saw in Eyes of Wakanda. The first event of this is that we see in 1896 that the Vibranium Axe mission that the characters go on in the episode was actually successful, and they take the actual axe back to Wakanda, and they actually take it back to Wakanda, which leads to a dark future in the 24th century, where a horde of aliens invades the Earth, and Wakanda doesn't stand with the rest of the world, so they end up sending their Black Panther back in time to make sure that the axe doesn't make it back to Wakanda, which in turn, from what it looks like, erases this universe from existence. So this universe was most likely pruned, but that's what I'm going off from the episode. It might turn out to not be true, but that's what I'm going with. And then we're going to jump to Earth 16828, the universe with the only one shot that's not canon, which is Team Thor. The main events of Team Thor Part 1 happened from 2015 and 2016. This is basically a little funny mockumentary kind of short where after the events of the Avengers Age of Ultron, Thor kind of moves in with this Australian guy named Daryl, and they end up just kind of bonding over just having random jokey moments that are meant to be kind of like setting up the tone for like Thor Ragnarok in a sense. And then we have Team Thor Part 2, which basically carries on the exact same tone through 2016. And then, of course, we have the main events of Team Daryl, which happened from 2017 to 2018. Basically, this is after the event, supposed to be after the events of Thor Ragnarok, where for some reason Thor has moved out of Daryl's house, and the Grandmaster moves in for some reason, and it kind of ends up this whole thing where Daryl basically hates living with the Grandmaster and wishes he had Thor back. It's kind of corny, but that's kind of why I love it. All right, now we're going to jump over to the Fox X-Men universe, the universe of the 10005, where we have the first event of this universe is X-Men First Class, where in 1962, a dangerous mutant by the name of Sebastian Shaw forms a group known as the Hellfire Club, who come after the United States, which causes both Charles Xavier to form the first class of mutants, being that of Magneto, Banshee, Mystique, Beast, Darwin, Angel, and Havoc. And eventually they all team up together to take down Sebastian Shaw, but in the end, Charles Xavier ends up paralyzed just like he is in the future. And of course, Mystique and Mystique and Eric end up going off with the remaining members of the Hellfire Club to form the first iteration of the Brotherhood of Mutants. Then we jump forward to 1979, where a man named James Howlett is actually a retired war veteran and is trying to live his peaceful life. And when his girlfriend gets killed, by his brother Sabretooth, he goes after him and enlists in the Weapon X program. It gives him it fuses a rare metal known as adamantium with his bones that turn him into this like killer. Wolverine goes after tries to find his brother, eventually learning that he was manipulated, and teams up against Major Stryker and also a version of Deadpool, where eventually Wolverine is shot in the head by an adamantium bullet to erase his memories, and he wakes up a normal man, just knowing that his name is Logan because of the name on his dog tags. Then we jump a lot forward to 2004, where we have the first X movie, where Wolverine ends up meeting a young mutant by the name of Rogue, who is actually being pursued by the Brotherhood of Mutants. They're then picked up by the first generation of they're picked up by the X-Men of this universe, which is made up of Cyclops, Jean Grey, and Storm, led by Charles Xavier. They all go up against Magneto, who wants to use Rogue's power to power a machine that will power a machine that will turn everyone in the world into mutants, just to eliminate the fact that the mutant world is basically suppressed in this world. Rogue is eventually captured by Magneto and used in the machine, but the X-Men are able to save her, and Magneto goes to prison. But Mystique ends up continuing to be out there and poses actually as a senator that Magneto killed earlier in the movie, so that they still have someone on the outside. Happening only a few months later, Wolverine actually left. I forgot to mention, Wolverine actually leaves the X-Men at the end of the first movie, trying to find out his past, but returns a few months later after learning that there's a dark plot being led by the guy that actually created him, Major Stryker, who is mind controlling mutants to try to ruin their reputation. He actually captures Charles and recreates Cerebro and tries to manipulate Charles into using Cerebro to kill all the mutants. But the X-Men team up with actually Magneto and Mystique to go after him, but they end up learning. But Magneto turns on them and uses the hypnotism to actually make Charles start targeting all humans. The X-Men are able to break in and steal and get him out and take him away. But then, of course, as they're trying to escape, a flood happens and Jean Grey actually dies at the end of this. Then we jump to 2006 for X-Men: The Last Stand, where 2 years after the main event, Cyclops is kind of in a weird funk because of Jean Grey's death, and that leads Storm and Wolverine to lead the team. He then finds out that Jean Grey is sort of alive, as she's now been reborn as the Phoenix and alter ego inside of her, as she kills both Cyclops and Charles. At the same time going on, there's also a mutant cure that has been created where the mutants can now just lose their power. They can get rid of their powers. Beast is the one who's actually overseeing this cure and actually joins the X-Men in this movie. The X-Men actually go after Magneto, who's actually trying to get rid of the cure, and they end up fighting him, where in the end Wolverine is actually forced to kill Jean, much to his dismay, and the X-Men kind of end up as dismayed as Magneto also loses his powers at the start of this movie. Then we jumped all the way to 2013, where after multiple years of mourning the death of Jean Grey, Wolverine is actually taken to Tokyo, where he is reunited with a man he saved multiple years ago, who actually has found a way to transfer Wolverine's mutant abilities to himself, so that Wolverine can die the happy death he wants to, and he can live forever like he wants to. Wolverine says no, and the guy dies. The next day, the rest of the movie, Wolverine ends up in a funk as his powers seem to suddenly stop working as he's trying to protect the daughter of a really wealthy man in Tokyo. He eventually learns that a villain named Viper took his powers, and Wolverine is able to get them back before running into the Silver Samurai, who is actually the man we thought died and is trying to get Wolverine's powers. And in the end, Wolverine kills him and decides to go back to the United States, where he is approached by Magneto and Charles, who end up having a mission for him. Then we jump a little later to 2017 to 2018, where we have the main events of The Gifted show from season 1 and season 2. I don't know if a ton that happens about this show because I barely remember much about it, but basically the main events of that show happening here. It's basically about two sides of different. It's basically two different mutant sides basically fighting against each other basically. Then we jump to 2023, where we have the main event, where we have the dark future of X-Men Days of Future Past, where the Sentinel program that was created by Bolivar Trask has finally created the machines that can wipe out all mutants and has killed most of them except for a small handful. But through all this, the mutants have discovered a small thing about them, which is Shadowcat has discovered a small future about her where she has the power to send someone's consciousness back in time to their younger body to change the past. And they find that they can actually if they can send one of them back in time to change the past before the Sentinels were ever created, they would create a whole new future. And so after much debate, the X-Men decide to send Wolverine back in time to his younger body, which actually sends him all the way back in time, which basically erases the entire X-Men timeline, everything after X-Men First Class, so everything from X-Men Origins Wolverine onwards is now erased from the timeline, slotting the rest of Days of Future Past in here in 1973, where Wolverine ends up arriving in his younger body in 1973 and works together with a younger Charles Xavier and Beast to try to prevent Mystique from killing Bolivar Trask to create the Sentinel program. They end up with some complications. They break Magneto out of prison, who ends up betraying them, and in the end they're able to change the future, which causes the whole timeline to rewrite. But Wolverine, as his mind goes back to the future, his body is actually captured by this timeline's major striker, who puts him back through the Weapon X program. Then we jump forward to 1983, where this world's first mutant known as Apocalypse comes back to life to take over the world and crafts his four horsemen out of Psylocke, Archangel, Storm, and Magneto. While Charles Xavier recruits a new version of the X-Men, including a younger Jean Grey, a younger Nightcrawler, and a younger Cyclops, and also Mystique and Beast. They all come together to fight Apocalypse, with eventually Storm and Magneto switching sides, and Archangel and Psylocke dying, and of course Apocalypse dying, while at the same time he tries to send his consciousness into Charles Xavier, but just makes him bald just like his future counterpart. But at the same time, at the very end, during the final battle of this movie, Jean Grey is able to unleash the full powers of the Phoenix Force, but this is something that gets followed up in the next movie. Then we jump to 1992, where we have the events of X-Men Dark Phoenix, where Jean Grey's Phoenix side finally comes out and accidentally kills Mystique, while at the same time she's being pursued by an alien race known as the Darben, where they are coming after her to get the Phoenix Force. Eventually, this all culminates with the X-Men kind of fighting her, and Jean Grey making the sacrifice to kill the Darben while flying off into the sunset, basically, presumably dying, as they rename the Charles Xavier School the Jean Grey School, but that kind of is something we'll follow up later. Next, we're going to jump to 2016, where we have the main events of Deadpool, where Wade Wilson is a mercenary who discovers he has cancer and is going to die soon. He enlists in a program that gives him that unlocks the dormant mutant abilities that make him literally indestructible. He then goes on a revenge quest to take out a man named Francis, who gave him superpowers but made him also look super ugly. He comes into conflict with, of course, two X-Men, Negasonic Teenage Warhead and Colossus. Eventually, they all team up together to take on Francis after he kidnaps Vanessa, Wade's love interest, and in the end, they're able to take out Francis, and Wade is able to return to his normal life. We then jump 2 years later to the events of Deadpool and Wolverine, where this movie has a little bit of an interesting thing, where during the opening minutes of this universe, mercenaries Deadpool is not doing well with actually kill Vanessa, and he ends up going on a revenge. He ends up on a little bit of a revenge quest he tries to join the X-Men, but he ends up failing and just gets sent to prison, where he is sent there with Fire Fist. At the same time, a man named Cable comes back in time from the future to try to kill Fire Fist before he becomes a villain in the future. Eventually, Wade tries to save Fire Fist by forming the X-Force, but all of them quickly die, apart from one named Domino. Eventually, they are forced to team up with Cable as Fire Fist is teamed up with Juggernaut, and they are able to work together with the X-Men as well to ensure a better future before eventually fixes Cable's time machine and does a bunch of random shenanigans to screw up the timeline by reviving Vanessa and reviving X-Force and killing a bunch of things before also going to the Sacred Timeline to temporarily do audition to be an Avenger before returning home. This then jumps forward to 2023, where the Wolverine that was living the alternate timeline in 1973 finally returns to his body in 2023, where he learns that the future is way brighter, and even people he thought he had long lost, like Cyclops and Jean Grey, are long alive, and he is able to catch up with this world's Charles Xavier. In 2024, this is where the homeworld events of Deadpool and Wolverine happens, where this world's Deadpool learns that his universe is dying due to his anchor being dying, and he eventually returns back here with this alternate Wolverine to save his world. Then we jump to 2026, where we have the main events of the New Mutants, where a collection of younger mutant characters are collected at this hospital and are experimented on, and with the pretense of that they're trying to control their power and told they could join the X-Men once they leave. However, they later learn that they are being raised to be killers and assassins. They turn on the host of the facility, and also the reflection of their deepest, darkest fears being created by one of them, magic, and they are able to escape and live on their own lives. We then jump to the events of 2029, where long after what we thought was a good ending in Days, where 6 years after the good ending that was given to us in Days of Future Past, the most mutants have once again died out due to a mutant gene cure that was put in corn syrup. Logan himself is starting to die from adamantium poisoning when he eventually learns where he eventually wants to protect this girl named where he wants to protect this team named Laura, who is or X-23, who he finds out is actually his daughter, as like a daughter in a sense. They're pursued by a clone of Wolverine named X-24, who actually kills Charles Xavier and also later Logan. Logan is then buried by X-23, who goes on to live her life. And then we jump to 2032, which is when Deadpool re-arrives in this, where Deadpool arrives to the future of this timeline to try to get this version's Wolverine after learning this is the anchor being who died. He then just finds a skeleton and sings bye 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 while he kills a bunch of TVA agents before leaving this universe. Alright, now we're going to jump into some of the X-Men related branches that we experience in the X-Men franchise. The first, of course, is the universe we're calling David Haller, where we have the events of the Legion show taking place in the 1970s and 1980s. This is basically the show about Charles Xavier's brother, who just never is Charles Xavier's brother because the show is completely set on a different Earth. That's basically the big premise of the show. It's very interesting and very weird, and I haven't watched a ton of it, so I can't really give my full breakdown of it. I just know this is when it takes place. Next, we're going to talk about the Wolverine montage universe. First off, which we don't know the times of any of these universes, we just know they exist. So first we have Patch's universe, the eye patch where we have Calvarine's universe, the Short Wolverine's universe, the Weapon X's universe, the Old Man Logan's universe, the Crucified Wolverine's universe, the John Byrne Wolverine's universe, and then the Mutant Genocide Wolverine's universe, the Wolverine we spend most of Deadpool and Wolverine with, the Wolverine that was away from the X-Mansion when all the X-Men got killed and so lives in regret of his actions. And then we have some of our variant universes we can talk about. We first have Cassandra Nova's home universe, which we know she was captured by the TVA and her universe got pruned. Then we have Nicepool and Dogpool's home universe, which they were captured and their universe got pruned. We have Babypool's home universe, which he was captured and pruned. We have Ladypool's universe, which she was captured and pruned. We have Cowboy Pool's universe, which he was captured and pruned. Kidpool's universe, which she was captured and pruned. Samurai Pool's universe, which he was captured and pruned. Welsh Pool's universe, which he was captured and pruned. Headpool's universe, which he was captured and pruned. And then Gambit's home universe, where he was captured and pruned. Now we're going to go into some of the legacy Marvel franchises that we talk about in this. The legacy Marvel franchises that are connected to the MCU that I haven't already talked about. The first of which is Earth 121698, the Tim Story Fantastic Four universe. The first events of this is set in 2004, the first Fantastic Four movie. Basically, the main events of the movie is pretty much the same as what you expect from the Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four members go up into space, they get irradiated by cosmic rays. When they come back down to Earth, they become some kind of wannabe superheroes as they kind of learn how to control their powers, but they end up coming into conflict with Doctor Doom, who also got powers from the cosmic radiation. They're eventually able to defeat him, and they become superheroes of this world. We then jump a couple years later, 2007, for Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer, where Reed and Sue are trying to have their wedding, but it's postponed by the Silver Surfer arriving on this Earth to declare it for death for Galactus. The Fantastic Four are able to eventually work with the Silver Surfer to get Galactus away from the Earth, and this ends in Sue and Reed finally being able to get married. And then we don't know how many long years, but at some point the Fantastic Four of this universe is captured and their universe does get pruned. Now we're going to jump to Earth 701306, the universe of the original Daredevil films. The first of which happening in 2003, in which we have the first Daredevil film in which Daredevil tries to protect Elektra, who is being pursued by this universe's Kingpin and this universe's Bullseye. And then we jumped a couple years later to 2005 for the events of Elektra, in which Elektra spins off in her own standalone story. And then at some point after this event, Daredevil and Elektra are captured by the TVA, and their universe does get pruned. And then we have Earth 26320, in which we have Blade's original universe, where Wesley Snipes' Blade's universe, where we first have his first film taking place in 1998, where Wesley Snipes comes up as an upcoming vampire hunter. Then we jump to 2000 for Blade 2, where he continues his reign to hunt vampires. And then we have Blade Trinity, where Blade actually teams up with Bloodsport in 2006 to go after multiple more vampires. And then we actually culminate with the Blade the series, which takes place in 2006, which doesn't star Wesley Snipes, but does take place in this universe. And that's that universe. And then we know at some point after that Blade is captured by the TVA and his universe does get pruned. All right, now we're going to venture into the what if universes. So we're going to start on Earth 82111, where we have the main events of Captain Carter's episode universe, where we start off in 1943, where we have the alternate where Peggy Carter gets a super soldier serum instead of Steve, and eventually goes on the World War II adventure, very similar, eventually ending in 1945, where Peggy actually gets stuck in a portal created by the Tesseract, where she is lost until 2011, in which she emerges from a different portal created by by the Tesseract at Project Pegasus. Then we see Peggy Carter goes through her version of the Battle in New York in 2012, which is basically the exact same, except she has a version of the Wasp there instead of the Hulk. Then we come to the events of 2014, where while Captain Carter is performing the Lumerian Star mission for Captain America the Winter Soldier, she is actually chosen by the Watcher to be part of the Guardians of the Multiverse, before arriving shortly after, where she finds the Hydra Stomper armor, which turns into her version of Captain America the Winter Soldier in episode 5 in 2014. And that's the last we've seen of that universe. Next, we're going to jump over to 21818, the T'Challa Star-Lord universe, where we start off in 1988, where T'Challa is accidentally abducted by the Ravagers instead of Peter Quill, which then jumps us all the way forward to 2008, where T'Challa actually is working as Star-Lord with the Ravagers. They've been able to redeem Thanos, and they work all together from a heist at Talavera Tavan's place to steal the Crystals of Genesis, which they are able to do before T'Challa is able to return back to Wakanda to tell his family that he's okay. And then shortly after that is when Ego arrives on Earth to get Peter Quill, and while T'Challa is fighting this battle, he is actually chosen by the Watcher to be part of the Guardians of the Multiverse. Then we jump to Earth 51825, the universe of the Avengers Assassinated, where the Avengers are assassinated by Hank Pym, who becomes Yellow Jacket in this Earth in 2010, basically during the events of Fury's Big Week, which eventually culminates in Loki taking over the Earth and ruling it, which eventually leads to, shortly afterwards, the Natasha Romanoff from a different Earth is actually allowed to join this universe's fight as a reward for being part of the Guardians of the Multiverse. Then we have Earth 91233, the universe of the corrupted Doctor Strange, where we have the first event on this Earth is in 2016, is when Stephen Strange, who is still with Christine Palmer in this Earth, gets in his fatal car accident that actually kills Christine in this universe. Then we jump forward to 2018, where after Doctor Strange has become the Sorcerer Supreme and has the Time Stone, he uses it to go back in time to 2016, where he performs multiple different time loops, where he basically tries to change Christine's death, but find he can't because it's an absolute point in time in this universe. It's like a canon event. And then but because he won't stop, a spell is put on him by the Ancient One, which causes one of Strange's souls to actually go live at the Lost Library of Cagliostro from 2231 BC to 1464 BC, and then he eventually learns of his alternate self, the Ancient One created, which is living life the way he's supposed to live up until 2018, when he is actually stolen by the Sinister Strange, causing the two of them to fight back in 2016, where the Sinister Strange is able to absorb his power, and then he bypasses the absolute point, which in turn dooms reality, which causes Strange to be locked in a pocket dimension. Shortly afterwards, the Watcher eventually returns to this universe to ask Doctor Strange for help in beating Infinity Ultron, which he agrees to do, which leads to Strange being chosen to be part of the Guardians of the Multiverse, which leads to him being back in this universe, watching over the Infinity Ultron body and Killmonger, making sure that they don't escape the pocket dimension that they've been trapped in. Then at some point afterwards, we have the events at the ending of season 2, where Stephen Strange has apparently been acquiring different people of power from across the multiverse to sacrifice them to his forge to reform his universe. However, Doctor Strange is thwarted by Peggy Carter and Kahori, where Doctor Strange finally makes a sacrifice to sacrifice himself, which officially destroys this universe. Then we have Earth 89521, which is the universe of the Marvel Zombies Earth in 2018, where Bruce Banner arrives on Earth during when he's supposed to Infinity War, but finds a zombified wasteland. He teams up with multiple other Marvel heroes to try to find a cure, which they end up finding one, but not before they. And while Peter Parker, T'Challa, and Scott Lang head off with the Mind Stone to Wakanda to make a cure, they end up learning that when Thanos arrived on this Earth, he also got infected by the zombie virus, and he has all five, or he already has the other 5 Infinity Stones, and he's probably going to want the 6th one when they arrive. Now we're going to jump to Earth 32938. This is the universe of What If Killmonger saved Tony Stark, where he saved Tony Stark from his abduction in 2008, and so becomes his protege, eventually using Tony Stark's technology to infiltrate Wakanda and take over as the new king, which eventually leads to shortly afterwards when Killmonger is almost ambushed by Pepper Potts and Shuri, where he is chosen to be part of the Guardians of the Multiverse. Then we jump to Earth 72124, the universe of the Party Thor, where we first have the first events of the episode in 2010, where Thor takes over Vegas to host an out-of-control party before eventually being forced to clean it up when his mother comes. And then shortly afterwards, he is chosen to be part of the Guardians of the Multiverse after multiple Ultron bots invade his universe, which is pretty cool. And then we jump to 2013, which is the main events of What If Howard the Duck Got Hitched, where during the events of the Convergence, Howard the Duck and Darcy Lewis have their child, Birdie the Duck, and they have to protect him from multiple different entities that want her. And then eventually, at some point later, we know that this is the home of Birdie's home reality because we see a video of it in episode of season 3, where we see that she is, where we know that this is where she comes from later on. All right, now we're going to jump over to Earth 29929. This is the universe of What If Ultron won, where we have a little bit of another one of these ranges where we have in 2015 is when Ultron wins against the Avengers and gets the Vision body. And then it culminates in 2018 when he gets the 5 other Infinity Stones from the Thanos of this timeline. And so it goes on to destroy all life in the entire universe, which eventually leads to him learning about the multiverse, which leads to episode 9 of the series where the Guardians of the Multiverse assemble on this Earth in order to stop Infinity Ultron. Then we have the Sicarian Iron Man universe, in which the universe where Tony Stark gets stuck on the other side of the portal in Avengers 2012 and gets stranded on Sakaar and teams up with Valkyrie, Korg, and Gamora to kind of take over this version of Sakaar before the two of them end up going over to kill Thanos in 2012, which eventually leads to them melting down Thanos' Infinity Gauntlet and later Gamora getting chosen to be part of the Guardians of the Multiverse. Then we jump to the Barren Wasteland, which is the universe where the first battle of episode 9 takes place because there's no other life to attract Ultron to this universe. So they use it as a planning ground so they can stage an ambush against Ultron. Then we jump to Xandar 625, the universe of What If Nebula joined the Nova Corps, where in 2019 Nebula becomes kind of like a Blade Runner detective, where she eventually is able to figure out the crime inside of Xandar and eventually is able to actually kill Ronan the Accuser before she eventually becomes the Nova Prime of this universe. And then at some point afterwards, the Guardians of the Multiverse arrive here in order to protect it from an invading squid monster before they kill it and head off. Then we jump to Celestial Invader Ego, the universe of episode 2 of season 2, where Peter Quill was actually delivered to Ego in this universe and so attacked the Earth in 1988, causing Howard Stark and Agent Carter to form the Avengers in 1988 with the available heroes at the time, and eventually it culminates with them defeating Ego and the Avengers going off to become the heroes of this world. Then we have Gamma and Happy Hogan, the events of episode 3 in 2014, where Happy Hogan gets stuck in a Die Hard parody against trying to protect Avengers Tower against Sam Rockwell's Justin Hammer, which is pretty cool. Then we jump to Tesseract Power Kahori, where in this universe the Tesseract fell to Earth and powered an ancient lake, where we have the main events of the episode happening in 1495, where Kahori gets magical powers before she is abducted by Doctor Strange at the end of the episode. Then we have Merciful Hela, the universe where in 959, instead of being banished to Hell, Hela gets banished to Earth, and so over the course of also getting acquainted with Wenwu, she eventually learns to be way more merciful and also becomes a little bit of a hero in this world. Then we jump to Forerunner Steve Rogers. This is the universe of the 1602 characters, where we first see in 1602 Captain Carter is pulled into this universe by this universe's Wanda. Then we have the main events of the 1602 episode where Peggy Carter works with this universe's 1602 heroes, with this universe's heroes to figure out why they're all stuck in 1602 and eventually is able to get them home using a device designed by Tony Stark. And then we have the ending of the episode where Stephen Strange arrives on this Earth to recruit Peggy Carter to his mission of capturing Kahori, which leads to the Project Rebirth destroyed universe, a universe where where Project Rebirth was destroyed, so no Peggy Carter, no Captain America, no Captain Carter. And we know at some point on this universe, Captain Carter arrives to capture Kahori before the two of them end up on Strange's Citadel. Then this leads to, after Doctor Strange does actually sacrifice himself to recreate his world, he creates a reforged universe, which is his exact universe, but with him never being born, but him being encased in every single atom of the universe to control it. At some point during this universe, Captain Carter and the Watcher arrive on it to kind of talk, and Captain Carter gets her new mission to be the leader of the Guardians of the Multiverse. And then at some point later on in season 3, the Watchers actually strand the Guardians of the Multiverse actually strand the Watchers in this universe so that they can depower them, so that they can have a talk and try to reason with them. All right, now we jump to the season 3 universes. First, we have the Invading Gamma Beast episode, where we first see that Hulk in an attempt to where Sam Wilson tries to befriend Hulk in this universe in 2014, and Hulk tries to be good, but he ends up losing control and creating the Gamma Beasts, which then jumps to 2024, where the main events of the episode take place, where the Avengers of this time use their mechs to fight the Gamma Beasts. Then we jump to the Cosmic Queen Agatha Harkness episode, where in 1947, Agatha Harkness and Kingo team up together to stop Arishem, to stop Tiamat from emerging from the Earth. Then we have the Stark Assassinated Prevented Earth, where in 1991, the Red Guardian actually is deployed to stop the Winter Soldier from assassinating the Starks, and they end up in a buddy road trip that ends in Bucky Barnes actually getting captured and taken back to the Red Room, and Red Guardian kind of hiding in America until 2012, when he is actually recruited to join the Avengers. Then we have episode 5, the Emergence Destroyed Earth universe, where the emergence did happen in this universe. And sometime in the 2020s afterwards, Mysterio apparently takes over the remains of the Earth, and Ironheart actually goes after him to stop him. Then we have the Wild West Heroes universe, the 1872 universe, where in the year 1872, Kate Bishop and Shang-Chi team up together as vigilantes to stop the Hood, and it's a huge Wild West Western parody. Then we have the Mjolnir-wielding Storm universe. One of the Guardians of the Multiverse that joins them this season is a version of Storm, who is actually the goddess of thunder. And then this is her home reality. We don't know much about it. Then we have the Reflective Infinity Ultron universe. This is the universe where we find another Infinity Ultron who, very much like last time, kills everybody again, where he beats the Avengers in 2015 and then gets the Infinity Stones in 2018 to kill everyone. The only difference is that this time he doesn't hear the Watcher, so he doesn't learn about the multiverse. And then at some point afterwards, the Guardians of the Multiverse arrive on this Earth to recruit him to be part of them, to help them defeat the Watchers. Then we also have the Destroyed Planet, which is the location for the first battle against against the Watchers versus the Guardians of the Multiverse. This is where that first battle happens before they end up ending up on the Reforged universe, which we talked about earlier. And there you guys have it. That is the last universe that we currently know about during the MCU timeline. I assume we're probably going to learn about a lot more going forward, especially because we're in the Multiverse Saga, but we'll see. And maybe after we get out of the Multiverse Saga, this chapter will just be the exact same length every time, and I don't have to do this chapter ever again. But thank you guys all very much for watching this video. Thank you for journeying through the multiverse with me. And I hope to see you guys next week when we're going to be venturing into the last part of this timeline. Part 4, the Multiverse Saga.